This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 637, entitled "The Political Jolt of 60% of Young Men Refusing to Date." Description. The fact that 60% of young American men refuse to date, as shown by a recent PEW Research poll, has deep implications for gender politics and especially for the causation of the crash in the birth rate that will soon wipe out whole populations if drastic measures are not soon undertaken. This flyer lists what the masculists need to do to educate the politicians and society to make the gender laws men fair, so that young men are a lot more prepared to be fathers again, rather than boycotting dating and parenting. The flyer itself. The political jolt of 60% of young men refusing to date, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. A recent Pew Research poll showed that over 60% of young men between 18 and 30 in the US are single and refuse to date. When I first read this, I felt thunderstruck, since its implications for gender politics and even for human survival are profound. Yet hardly anyone, especially politicians, are even talking about it. Talk about myopia, lack of vision, lack of social responsibility on the part of these politicians. This flyer is a diatribe against the politicians who are not facing up to the enormous implications of this 60% dating boycott on behalf of young men. Before I start cracking the whip at these irresponsible, myopic politicians, let me spell out clearly just what these implications are. Thinking people, are becoming slowly more conscious that there is a catastrophic crash in the birth rate across the planet that obviously cannot continue, since if it does, humanity wipes itself out. Since survival of humanity is humanity's top priority, extreme authoritarian measures will eventually be needed to force both sexes to reproduce or to suffer extreme penalties. We have not yet got to that stage, but if the catastrophic birth rate continues, then simple math says that we wipe ourselves out. So sooner or later, the politicians will be forced to bite the bullet and take measures to stop the decline in the birth rate, which in time will be seen to be humanity's greatest existential threat, even worse than a nuclear holocaust or a catastrophic change in climate. To illustrate the seriousness of the birth rate crash, consider Seoul, the capital of South Korea, which has, as far as I know, the planet's lowest birth rate, in brackets, excluding Vatican City, which is a special case, which consists of religious MGTOW monks, close brackets. That birth rate is just under 0.6, that's children per woman, which is under a third of the replacement rate of 2.1 children per woman. So if the current birth rate in Seoul continues, in brackets, and it will probably only get worse in reality, close brackets, then in a mere century, Seoul is effectively no more, since in 4 generations there'll be a third of a third of a third of a third of the population surviving. That is about 1%. The other 99% will have died off, so Seoul will have given up the ghost. Many countries are now well under the replacement rate, so they too will suffer the same fate, but a bit slower. But if birth rates remain significantly below replacement rates, then simple math says that whole populations, whole countries, wipe themselves out. This much should be obvious, so what are politicians going to do about it? ? This flyer castigates today's politicians for not even having the crash in the in the birth rate on their conceptual horizons, on their radars. This is not true for all countries. For example, Hungary is spending about 5% of its GNP on birth promotion, paying mothers hefty motherhood allowances. Russia too. But many of the migrant nations, like the US, Canada, Australia, etc., are putting off thinking about the problem because they argue that they can fill the population gap in their countries with immigrants. But this argument cannot last much longer, since the populations of the countries that supply the immigrants are themselves crashing. Even Africa, the dumbest continent, and hence the most backward, both socially and economically, is seeing its birth rate approaching replacement rate in some countries. So the anticipated flood of black migrants to the rich countries, e.g. to Europe, will not be sustainable due to the population sizes of African countries also diminishing sharply. So what do masculists do relative to the politicians to turn this problem around so that we don't wipe ourselves out? There are a string of things that need to be done that will require leadership on behalf of the politicians. But before these politicians come out of the woodwork, they first need to be educated about the problem. And that is where the masculist theorists come in. The first task in tackling this population crash problem is education. The masculists need to educate society that modern marriage is so toxic for men that now 2/3 of young men refuse to marry, reject paternity, and spend their money on themselves, seeing the divorce horrors committed on their fathers, their uncles, their older male friends in the hated, fluffy feminist controlled divorce courts, which butcher the lives of one father in 4, destroying his life and causing the masculists to have a hatred against the fluffy feminists who took over these divorce courts and made them a slaughterhouse for men. Today's politicians are largely ignorant of masculist ideas, so by default are mostly male feminists, since the only gender politics they have heard of is feminist. Most women today have been influenced by feminist ideas and believe that gender oppression is a one-way street, since that is all they have heard. When you are monoconscious, that is, you've only had your feminist consciousness raised, then you will be angry at men for the ways that men oppress women, that feminism teaches you. Since you know nothing about masculist ideas, you do not have your feminist anger at men for the ways that men oppress women cancelled by your masculist anger at women for the ways that women oppress men. And in fact, far worse, since many of women's gender crimes against men are horrible and last decades, making them far more serious than the relatively minor ways that men oppress women. This bi-consciousing of society is one of the top priorities of the masculists, who aim to teach society that gender oppression is very much a two-way street, and that in fact women oppress men worse. Over the next few years, there will be millions of bitter, verbally violent confrontations between misandrist, monoconscious feminists and angry, hateful, bi-conscious masculists who have no patience nor tolerance for the sexist, hypocritical bigotry of monoconscious feminists and will bite their fucking heads off. The masculists will also be sharply critical of the politicians for their ignorance of masculist ideas and will put powerful moral and political pressure on them to learn masculist ideas so that measures can be taken in time to stop whole populations from wiping themselves out. Masculists need to harangue politicians that they have a powerful moral duty as political leaders to become bi-conscious, or in the limit, they will face the risk of assassination as extremely hateful and politically violent masculists take the law into their own hands, as it becomes increasingly clear that the population is crashing catastrophically, and that if nothing is done, then we will wipe ourselves out. So these politically violent masculist soldiers will murder the politicians for doing nothing, accusing these politicians of being guilty of extreme criminal negligence. So the Masculists have a hefty educational program on their hands. They have to crush monoconscious feminists by biting their fucking heads off if they don't convert themselves into bi-consciousness, which by definition means that they have also had their masculist consciousness raised by learning the main ideas of the Masculists. The Masculists will also attack the feminist journalists who block publication of Masculist articles, thus making these monoconscious feminists, in brackets MFBs equals monoconscious feminazi bigots, close brackets, members of what the Masculists call the Femmafia. That's F-E-M-A-F-I-A. That is the female media mafia, who hypocritically promote feminist ideas and reject and block masculist ideas, making themselves truly hated by the Masculists for their sexist hypocrisy. Masculists will spread their ideas into the high schools and colleges, and this process is already well underway now, with most upper middle class, high IQ type males in the Western countries already aware how toxic modern marriage is, and are choosing not to marry, not to have kids, and to spend their money on themselves. Proof of this growing awareness is the 60% of young men in the US refusing to even date women, since they don't want to marry because divorce is so toxic, and they find monoconscious feminist women undateable because these young women are too obnoxious to be appealing to men, so are left rotting on the shelf. Masculists will educate society that gender oppression is a two-way street, so that the high school, the campuses, the journalists, the media, society at large, and especially the politicians will become conscious that to overcome the birth rate crash, fundamental changes will need to be made in society, especially on the masculist front, before men will be prepared to be fathers again. Politicians need to be aware that if they don't soon mend fair the gender laws, then the Masculists and MGTOWs will continue to boycott marriage and paternity, and hence consciously and explicitly wipe humanity out. This is the great weapon that the manosphere holds over the politicians and society as a whole. The politicians will need to establish GECs, G-E-Cs, in the parliaments, in brackets, GEC, G-E-C, equals Gender Equality Committee. That consists half of female feminists and half of male masculists, so that the gender issues of both sexes are dealt with equally, which is far from being the case today. The masculist half of the GECs will need to make fundamental reforms in society, the main one being the fipping of women, the creation of a FIP society, where both sexes are socialised and educated to be FIPs, so that the divorce courts can be based on the principle of financial independence of both parties in the divorce. That is, both the father and the mother are assumed to be FIPs, so that alimony can be thrown out, custody of the kids be given jointly by default, the halving of wealth and stuff be scrapped, etc. The paternity rejection right needs to be legislated so that men are given the same right as women to reject an unwanted pregnancy that can destroy a man's life, forcing him against his will to pay for a kid he didn't want, thus manslaving him for 2 decades into forced fathering, one of the greatest and most hated gender crimes that women commit against men. The OPTAB, O-P-T-A-B, obligatory paternity testing at birth for all births, also needs to be legislated to block women's paternity fraud, another massive and hated gender crime that women commit against men. The masculist GEC politicians then need to systematically, across the board, remove those legal discriminations against men, thus men fairing the gender laws, so that young men are a lot more prepared to be fathers again, so that we do not wipe ourselves out. These men fair gender laws need to be passed soon, before more drastic political measures need to be undertaken, e.g. labelling people who refuse to reproduce as life leechers, who leech off the life of their parents who raised and paid for them, but who don't do the same for the next generation. Politicians can heavily tax non-parents and mount a hefty propaganda campaign that effectively criminalises life leechers. Politicians can also use other methods to raise the birth rate, for example by establishing baby farms, by paying professional mothers to churn out babies who are raised by government-paid female child raisers and professional male caregivers and role models for boys. Schools need to have a 1-to-1 sex ratio in teachers, so that boys are given male role models by male teachers. The whole question of how to raise the birth rate needs to be taken up by the politicians, and that will entail learning a lot more about masculism, so that men are no longer penalised by the law, by divorce, by monoconscious feminists, by monoconscious high schools and campuses, etc. A lot remains to be done to make society bi-conscious. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Manslaves to Women, an e-textbook of 630 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses. Freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. These flyers are available in text and video formats on Minds, BitChute, Odyssey and MGTOW.tv. Ciao.